Thank you all for coming. We are so excited to be here. I'm the relatively new editor-in-chief of Brainchild. I purchased the business about 2 years ago, and I try to strive to meet the mission to bring the voices of women and mothers of different circumstances and backgrounds together on the page as well as on our website and online communities. So we really thank you for coming, and we have a great treat because 6 of our longtime favorite writers are here tonight to read a little bit of their pieces, about 5 minutes each, from Brainchild. So our first reader is going to be longtime contributor Tracy Mayer. She's written for Brainchild about Armageddon parenting, which she's going to read from tonight, soccer mom stereotypes, swearing in front of the kids. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times Motherload blog, the Rumpus, Boston Magazine, Boston Globe, Child, Wonder Time, etc. So welcome to Tracy.
Thanks. So one of the things, I wrote that article about swearing for the very first issue of Brainchild, which I think was 13 years ago. Am I doing my math right? So now my kids are old enough to be teaching me the swear words. One thing I really love about Brainchild is they will just let you go with the subject that you are not going to find in these, mainstream magazines. And this was one of them. I said to the editors, I'm getting a little obsessed about this, I'm in a dark place at the end of the world and I want to write about it. They're like, this does not sound like any fun, but try to read the rest of the article if you get a chance, because I got to interview Bill McKibben, who's a huge, environmentalist, and it was really cool to talk to him. And one of the things that's great is you just get to pick up the phone and call people and say, I'm writing an article, so you can interview all kinds of people, and that was really great with this story. It's called Armageddon Mama. Last February, a freak storm blew through our region one weirdly warm Thursday night, packing flooding rain and winds that caused millions of dollars of damage in about 10 minutes. I was out for the night, a rare occurrence, and drove home over pitch-dark roads amid downed power lines and whole stands of toppled pine trees. 3 times I started down familiar streets only to have to turn back because they were impassable. When I finally pulled into our debris-strewn driveway after midnight, I found our power out and the dog waiting anxiously by the door. My boys, a teen and a tween, had gone to bed, but my husband Tom was waiting up for me, nodding off at the kitchen table, surrounded by the happy glow of a dozen winking tea lights. Those tiny, useless candles, left over from a dinner party, pretty much constituted the whole of our emergency preparedness staff. Once upon a time, after 9/11 to be precise, we'd half-heartedly stocked up on bottled water, flashlights, batteries, and duct tape, with a few cans of Dinty Moore beef stew thrown in for good measure. But over the years, the cache had been raided. The water went to a school function, and the stew to a canned food drive. The duct tape was commandeered for a Halloween costume. Our collection of flashlights, at one time carefully kept within easy reach for just such an emergency, had been scattered to the 4 corners of our property after a late-night game of outdoor tag. The batteries we'd hoarded had long since been reassigned to game controller duty. I rummaged through a trunk drawer and found a tiny pen light for each of us, then gave up and crawled into bed, grateful that I'd finally broken down a few months earlier and bought us all real-down comforters, which kept us warm as the temperature sank. By morning, the house was down to 53 degrees. In town, power lines swung aimlessly and whole neighborhoods were blockaded by uprooted trees. Most frightening to any New Englander, there wasn't an open Dunkin' Donuts 20 square miles. Shaken, I returned home and took charge of the situation, the way a person might who'd long ago attended Girl Scout camp. I dragged our grill out from its winter hiding place, fired up the briquettes, and brought a huge pot of water to a boil. Look, I said proudly to my sons who were just emerging from their lairs, we can make instant coffee, Swiss Miss, and oatmeal, and still have enough left over for a spritz bath. Oh my God, I'm not washing up in a spaghetti pot. That was my 16-year-old Connor, who pulled out his iPhone and started tapping. Within 90 seconds, he determined that A, our street wasn't due to get power back for 3 days, B, one neighborhood of new construction where the power lines had been buried was already back online, and therefore, C, he needed a ride to the house of his friend immediately. Don't you want to play bananagrams with us in front of the fireplace, I said, forlornly trailing behind him as he tossed some clothes and his toothbrush into a duffel bag. He gave me a pitying glance. I'll be in the car waiting. And that was the last we saw of that kid for 72 hours. It was just as well. As it turns out, board games in a dark, cold house with a flooding basement kind of suck. Once night fell, Tom, our 12-year-old Will, and I gave up trying to be troopers and just went to bed. As I huddled under the comforter, I couldn't stop my mind from worrying about the bigger picture. Anxiety-wise, the 2000s had been a tough decade for parenting. Y2K set the mood, and 9/11 shook us to the core, and suddenly between changing diapers and taking pregnancy tests, we were worrying about anthrax in the mail. The new millennium brought us 2 wars, 2 recessions, a flu pandemic, an autism epidemic, childhood obesity crisis, housing crisis, healthcare crisis, crisis in public education, toys made with phthalates, BPA, and lead paint from China. Meanwhile, the baking globe continued to cook up ecological disasters as we hopelessly watched the devastation from the string of Florida hurricanes, the Indonesian tsunami, New Orleans, and Haiti. It was almost disrespectful not to wonder, could any of that happen here to my family? As parents, we are being told to raise our 21st century kids to be well-educated, hard-selling, fast-moving entrepreneurs in a fully wired, completely interconnected, always-on global marketplace of ideas and innovation. But what if that wasn't what the near future will look like? What if we're raising our kids to succeed in a George Jetson kind of world, but they wind up living like Fred Flintstone? I propped myself up in bed and elbowed Tom. What if this goes on indefinitely, I said. I don't think our kids have the right coping skills for life off the internet. Ditching your family in favor of heat and light sounds like an excellent coping skill to me, Tom said dryly. In a real crisis, I'd follow the self-involved teenager every time.
Thank you. Our next reader is Francesca Kaplan Grossman, and her work has appeared in Brainchild, the New York Times Motherlode, Interview Magazine, S3 Magazine, and Glass Cases. And when not wrangling with her 2 mini monsters, she's slaving over her first novel, The Night Nurse, and her memoir, In Remission, Life and Love in the In-Between. Francesca is in our winter issue, our new winter issue, and she's going to read a piece from that issue called Beneath the Surface. Thank you.
I feel like I have to take some books off. Thank you. I wanted to thank Marcel and all the wonderful writers in Brainchild. I'm a newbie, and if you're not familiar with the magazine, it's just a wonderful, wonderful, I'm a newbie both in Brainchild and also in parenting. And it's just a wonderful resource for moms, and it just has some beautiful essays and funny essays and all kinds of stuff. And I will also say that when you hear the beginning of my essay, reading in this space feels very odd, so I'm just going to acknowledge that. Okay. It's called Beneath the Surface. The first time I shit my pants, I was on the platform of the number 6 train. I was 26, and a cup of coffee I'd sipped now led to stomach pain I can only classify as agonizing. Though I did everything in my power to get up the subway steps and to a nearby restaurant to relieve it, my cold, shaking body had to let go 3 steps from the top. The problem in a situation like that, I've since learned, is that walking makes it worse and stopping gets you nowhere. Now covered in a putrid brown film that no one could mistake for anything else, I sprinted in shame to my gym, a place that had become my salvation. I rushed into the shower with all my clothes on, peeled them off, pumped bright green body soap into the crotch of my jeans, and threw away my balled-up underwear in a naked dash from the scalding shower. When I was finished, I sat on the cold metal bench with towels draped all over me, my jeans and t-shirt and bra draped on the bench beside me. How could I possibly live a normal life like this? How could I one day take care of someone else, a child, my child, like this? I should tell Nick it's over, I thought. Let him find a woman who is healthy and strong and always ready for life. Yet I felt elated, having escaped the stomach pain that had overtaken me a half hour earlier. It was blissful to pause, like a welcome inhalation of normalcy. A delicate young woman with a black staff gym t-shirt came over to me in the locker room. "Are you okay?" she asked me. I nodded, unable to speak. "Do you want me to dry those for you?" she asked gently. I sighed with gratitude, nodded my thanks, and sat in tiny white towels for the next 45 minutes, while a woman I didn't know dried my shit-stained clothes. She handed them to me in a CVS bag someone had left behind. I had no choice but to put them back on. I proceeded to walk home to Nick, 73 blocks and 2 avenues and 1 bridge, just so I wouldn't have to go on the subway again. Our son was 12 weeks old when Nick went into the hospital for the first time. His migraine was now 6 days old. The second time we were practicing both migraines and newborns, but this time was accompanied by stomach pain that drove him to his knees. Covered with monitors, IVs, and confusion, Nick stared at me in disbelief. I could only stare back. We were in the wrong roles and we didn't know how to act them out. I grabbed his hand and squeezed the bruise that had started to form beneath the IV needle. He winced and I mouthed, "I'm sorry." So I did what he always did for me. I called his family, got him ginger ale, cleaned his chin, rubbed his back, sat in the chair, and waited for answers. We don't have an answer, even today, for the disease that clots Nick's blood. Until we know what that is, and probably if we do, he has to take a blood thinner that prohibits him from any activity where he may bump his head and bleed to death. He can't ski or play basketball, and if he gets into a car accident, the prognosis is grim. But there's more. Our roles have changed and meshed into one. There's no longer the strong and the struggling. Now we're both. There's not much we can do. We can go to yoga on Tuesday mornings. I can work part-time. We can both take generic Paxil, and we do. We stretch our dollars, we cook on Sundays, we watch Millionaire Matchmaker and chuckle. Even in the most peaceful, mundane, white picket fence version of our lives, there's a tinsel-thin fear. Another knowledge, one neither of us will admit. Sure, I'm scared he'll collapse again from the pain of a clot, shield his eyes from the agony of light, or that his bruises will spread until they paint his skin purple. Or worse, that we won't see the bleeding and it will drown him from the inside. I'm scared I'll be aimlessly squeezing my flesh and come upon something that won't be so easy to remove and will snowball rapidly. But there's more than that. It's quiet and it's this fear, and it says, to have two sick parents is a curse. And as I tuck in my son and I kiss the wispy hair on the back of my daughter's sweet head, it whispers around the room. What if they lost both of us and had to fend for themselves? Even worse, I wonder if there are silent horrors swimming beneath their skin. Will their genes betray them? What have we done? It does not escape me that my two children grew out of me the same way everything else has. They too started tiny and unnoticed, growing into the small, wonderful people they've become. I made them. We made them, which can't be good. When one of them gets a cold, I prepare for tuberculosis. When one of them has a bruise, I take a sharp breath in, praying it will not grow, and fevers while they just about crush me. Will my daughter shit her pants on the 6th train? Will my son be attacked by nuts of bloods in his vein? Will they grow things the size of olives or walnuts, golf balls under their skin? Will they demand they be removed? Will they hate us for it? I didn't drink alcohol for 9 months, both times I was pregnant. I power walked, I did yoga, tried to sleep well, limited my medications to those that were absolutely necessary. I ate eggs. I did everything I was supposed to do to keep my babies safe and healthy. But I couldn't give them healthy, strong parents. And I don't know how to live with that. We have dinner together every night, the four of us, like the family we hope to be. Mama, my son says, his dark brown eyes wide, a yogurt mustache tracing his upper lip. Yes, I say, controlling myself not to wipe it off for him. Will you take me to school tomorrow? I can't, babe. Why? My daughter parrots, why? In a 2-year-old voice that barely makes sentences work, but her blue eyes are expectant. I have to go to the doctor, guys. You always have to go to the doctor, my son replies, annoyed. So there's that. I can do juice cleanses and downward dog, myself into my 40s. I can strip the negativity from my bones and delete phone numbers from people who will never be real friends. Nick and I can eat more quinoa, love each other late into Sunday night, cut up credit cards, and find family-friendly bikes. But the real possibility that something new is happening, is growing beneath the surface of our collective skin, is almost too impossible for me to stomach, though the only choice is for us to try.
Our next reader is Dr. Robin Schoenthaler, and she has a huge piece coming out in the Boston Globe in a couple of weeks related to her, called Our Hollywood, related to her son's recent Hollywood appearance with Kate Winslet. So we're going to watch out for that essay. Tonight she's going to read from her piece from Brainchild. She's also written for Reader's Digest, Pulse Magazine, More Magazine, and she is a physician writer with many awards to her name. So welcome, Robin.
So when the piece that I'm going to read was in one of the very earliest also issues of Brainchild back in 2002. Back in those days, I used to write about traumatic events, but I've given that up. It was too overwhelming. High on the list of traumatic events in my life when my children were I was a parent of younger children. I was never a younger parent. I was a parent of younger children, and the big trauma in our lives was airplane rides, which were always, I'm a solo parent, so it was just me and 2 little children. One giant trauma after another. And so I wrote about many horrible airplane trips, mostly to California. I wrote about one where we had 6 cancellations in 4 days, and both of my children were under 4. And I wrote about one where all of our seatmates bought me a round of drinks at 9:30 in the morning. I wrote about when my son, who was about 5, yelled from the back of the airplane, "Mom, the biggest poop I've ever made in my life is stuck in the toilet." And I carried my newborn down. But this was actually better than those. So, this was also, I should add, there was some 9/11 stuff also in this, obviously a seminal event for many of us, and so I'm going to skip over most of that stuff and just concentrate on the real terror, being with my 2.9-year-old son, Cooper, still in the full flower of his terrible twos, getting on a plane with my older son, Kenzie, who was 6 and an easy season traveler, to go again across the country. We got 16 feet onto the American Airlines Airbus when my napless toddler Cooper started to throw a tantrum about which seat he was going to get. A full-fledged kicking the chairs and slapping the mama tantrum. I took him, as I always did, to the loo, trying to distract him from the heartbreak of an aisle seat. Instead, I found myself in yet another locked lavatory with yet another child straight out of The Exorcist. 10 to 15 minutes into the tantrum, a handsome male flight attendant, who I eventually learned was one of 11 kids, knocked timidly on the door and said he was very sorry, but the pilot really wanted to move the plane. I managed to get the door open wide enough for him to see what Cooper looked like. Together, the two of us carried the bucking bronco back to our seats, where he continued kicking and screaming and trying to strangle himself with the seatbelt. The fabulous flight attendant, Captain Mark, we came to call him, and I, and most of the people near us, did everything we could to try and calm Cooper down. All these prairie dog-type heads kept bobbing up and down around us saying, "Hey, Cooper, want some candy? Hey, Cooper, want a toy?" To absolutely no avail. He was a child possessed. At this point, Captain Mark told us that the real Captain Brian, really needed to move the plane, and I had to get a seatbelt on him. Then he stood and looked at Cooper for another 10 seconds and said, "Oh, never mind, just hold him." By that time, I was basically laughing. It was so horrible, and saying, I'm sorry, to everyone around us. Let's see, where is it? I held Coop in I held Coop in a 4-point, 4th degree black belt advanced martial degree advanced martial arts hold that was not part of my original What to Expect from Your Toddler book, and he kicked the seats in front of us so hard that they moved the guy in front of us to another seat, and then they finally started the plane, although we couldn't hear it for all of Cooper's hollering. He stayed at full pitch until we were above the clouds and the seatbelt sign had gone off. At which point I dumped him unceremoniously and probably not too gently onto the floor. He crawled under the seat and pulled the tray table down under him, sort of intuitively creating a darkened cave away from all the stairs and whispers, and he calmed himself down in 90 seconds flat. The silence was deafening, except for him saying, "All better, Mama." I, however, was all numb, except for the sweat dripping down. In the meanwhile, Captain Mark was busy giving all the people around us free drinks and free movies. First time in all my traveling days I have ever seen that. Cooper, meanwhile, got out of his man cave, started walking around all darling and sweet, saying, "Hi, I'm Cooper," and all these people were laughing, saying, "Yeah, we know. You're the guy who got us these free drinks." So we toddle along at 30,000 feet for a couple of hours. At one point, we have this totally sweet scene of Kenzie and Cooper sitting side by side reading a book. Cooper says he has a bug bite on his scalp just below the crown, and Kenzie, probably modeling me, reaches down to kiss it. He kisses, and in the process, he leaves a big wad of blue gum in Cooper's hair. I'm ready to belt them both, but I try to concentrate on getting the gum out. I grab some ice from somebody's free drink and rub it, but it has little or no effect. Every time I tug, Cooper starts to yell, and I'm dying of fear that he's going to go apeshit again. In desperation, I reach up and ring for a flight attendant, but we get Sergeant Skybitch. He says, "Are you the noisy one?" And then I go on and on about trying to find a sharp object on the We can't find any. Finally, I can't get them anywhere, but finally we connect uneventfully to flight number 2. I tell Cooper, without even pausing, that I will jump off the plane after pulling the emergency chute if he so much as hiccups on the next flight. Within half an hour, he's gone guiltlessly to sleep, looking blissful and angelic, tucked into a cozy red blanket with his hair nicely tousled on the airplane pillow. Unfortunately, when he awakens and sits up, the pillow sits up with him. It's solidly stuck to the back of his head. Kenzie, heretofore viewing all this action in silence, says maybe we could just push his head up against the seat and he'll stick there. We could leave him behind. We are, as a family unit, about as far gone as we get. We checked into a hotel, a nice hotel, at 1 a.m, with half of an airplane paper pillow hanging from the back of the head. 2 days later, despite the fact that I tried to ignore it, Cooper's gum, this flat blue hard mass embedded with pieces of airplane paper pillowcase, 2 Skittles, little leaves, and pieces of grass was simply drawing too much attention even for me. And I took him to the only beauty parlor I could find near the hotel, also a fancy one. And the hairdresser must have stared at me without blinking for a solid 30 seconds before she harumphed her way over to Cooper, who was sitting, smiling at himself in the mirror. She did a bowl cut so short I could see his birthmarks for the first time since birth. The gum, food, and vegetation vanished along with his hair, and we left her muttering, despite the excellent tip that I left her, about how the hell she was going to clean out her razor. Cooper was perfect in the chair and perfect thereafter, and he and Kenzie were known all over the hotel for the rest of the trip as the Gum Boys. It is great to travel with family, but ever since then we've made a point of every time we traveled together for a number of years, we made sure that each family member had their own special friend. Mr. Benadryl, Mr. Robitussin, nighttime coffee, Mrs. Marguerite.
Thank you. Our next reader is Margot Page. She's a prize-winning essayist whose favorite topics include parenting without drudgery, traveling with kids, and Pope Francis. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Brainchild, and elsewhere, and she has her new book out, Paradise Imperfect, which is for sale in the other room, and she lives in Seattle with her children and works at Microsoft. Thank you.
I'll put the book here so you can look at it. If it falls, that's cool. So my Dear Drudgery column for Brainchild is funny, and my book is funny, and for some reason I have chosen a piece that makes me cry. Which is kind of appalling, really. Like, when I think about it, like, oh, I'm so touched by my own words. I have embarrassment about that, but it makes me cry. So if I cry, I'm sorry. When I practiced to make sure it was going to not be over 5 minutes, I cried. And I'm starting halfway through because it's a fairly long piece, and the thing that you need to know is that the piece is called Disappearing Act, and it is from last year's Brain Teen issue, and it starts with the premise, this thing that I didn't really own until my kids started getting older, which is if you do it right, they leave. And that, for me, is the cruelest truth of parenting. Like, if you get this shit right, they're out the door. So that's the premise of the piece, and that all happens before you come in. And we are at this time living in Costa Rica, where we were living there for a year with our family, and our kids were 12, 9, and 5 when we went. And it turns out that even if you do a really creative thing, like hey, let's go to a foreign country where she doesn't speak the language, and then she won't leave, she'll have to be with us, they still find a way. And so Hannah had found a way, and she spent most of her time reading in her bedroom and not hanging out with us and not playing with her brother and sister, and that is where we pick up. And I'm growing my bangs, so I have a very Rand thing going on. And we lived alone at the top of a mountain in Costa Rica. One April afternoon, our hillside sparkled impossibly green. Hummingbirds hovered, and all manner of background wildlife had set to chattering and chirping. The soundtrack of our life would not have been out of place at a day spa. I was in the kitchen making chayote soup in a non-obsessive manner. That's important. One of the reasons I had to get out is that I'm fairly tightly wound. I was in the kitchen making soup in a non-obsessive manner. I had told Ivy I'd be happy to stop cooking and play with her. All she had to do was stop saying my ideas were stupid. Ivy's our 5-year-old. She's quite a work of art. And Hannah's the big girl who had left us 6 months before to just be solitary. But Ivy was stuck in the groove of her own irritability and so showed no signs of exhaustion. Hannah was up in her loft as usual, deep in 100 Years of Solitude. After the slow start and the revelation that this book was going to be way weirder than anything she had ever encountered, Hannah was hooked. We had barely seen her for 2 days. Ivy finally got to the heart of it. It is so stupid that Hannah never wants to play anymore. By now, I was annoyed too. What the hell? We'd brought Hannah halfway across the world and she couldn't be bothered to come out of her bedroom. Then, from behind the foreground pulsing of Ivy's frustration, I heard a tiny arrhythmia, a sad little sigh, the snapping of a book closed, the barely perceptible background sounds of resignation. After a pulling it together pause, Hannah appeared at the top of the stairs. Ivy and I watched her descend. Hannah's jaw was set firmly and her ponytail did not bounce. Ivy, what you need... No, actually, never mind you. What this house needs, Ivy glared, is some strawberries, said Hannah. I have totally had it with the lack of strawberry pie in this house. It's insane. I'm going outside. Patches of wild strawberries dotted our hillside. We had eaten a few, but as a concept, they'd failed to take hold. It might have been a girl next door thing. The berries were always there. Why bother with them, what with all the sexed up mangoes and papayas constantly throwing themselves at us? Hannah marched to the kitchen and grabbed all the plastic storage containers we owned. 4. I'm going to need all of these because the berry deficiency we're dealing with here is acute. Take a peek, my Hannah. And then, as afterthought, Ivy, you can help if you'd like. Hannah held out her hand for a millisecond, but did not coax. She dropped a container as she left, not looking back. Ivy stood her ground, eyes narrow. Then she walked over, grabbed her faded ladybug boots, and snatched up the Tupperware. Yeah, she threw back at me on her way out. It's insane. I watched them out the window. After a while, Hannah flopped to the ground and lifted her face to the sun. When Ivy wandered near, Hannah peered into her container and picked out a perfect berry. She pulled her little sister into her lap and fed her like a baby bird. Was Hannah back? Was she toying with us? Would a tiny lecture along the lines of, "It's about time," be out of place? When my girls finally came back inside, I said this, yum. I'd known the basics about the leaving, but I hadn't quite known it would hurt quite so much, or that it would affect our whole family, that no clever gimmick could forestall the inevitable. I know now that I couldn't have hoped for a lovelier departure. Hannah had simply slipped away, wanting none of our delightful familial hilarity. There was no yelling and no doors slammed. It was our starter goodbye. And over the next years, Hannah would vanish again and again, into friendships, boyfriends, politics, sometimes gracefully, often not. Rules would be broken, curfews missed. I think about my own youthful goings away. I went far, stayed away long, and like my daughter, was not always kind. And yet, 3 summers ago, back home, I caught a cold that got worse instead of better. I got the pneumonia diagnosis 2 days before Ivy's birthday, and with a work deadline looming, I didn't have time for pneumonia. Desperate, I called my mother's house. When my stepdad heard the tears in my voice, he said, "I'm coming to get you." I stayed for a week. My mother fed me soup and made me sleep. She called my house and told my family to deal. I curled up. My mommy drew me baths. I was 44 years old. If you do it right, they leave. The cruelest truth, the truth we cannot trick away, is that it's our job to let them go. But my firstborn's adolescence taught me the most beautiful corollary. How had I missed it in all my reading? Or maybe nobody says it because nobody wants to jinx it. They come back. And when they do, being there, not judging, not furious that they left in the first place, is part of the job too. At 13, Hannah sighed, put down her book, and rejoined our family while I watched through a window. Being there now doesn't look like the proactive parenting of the early years. When, after long silences, my big girl wants to chat about a boyfriend or cry over the phone with the sheer exhaustion of being responsible for her own life, I listen. If she's home, I get to tuck her hair behind her ear in the old way, and I'll provide whatever haven she needs 30 years from now if she has to flee that life for a while. I'll draw her a bath. 5 years after Hannah first disappeared, Ivy and I dropped Hannah off at her freshman dorm and drove off crying. She was gone for good this time, 2 airplanes away from home. Ivy doubled over in the rental car, hugging her sides for maximum drama, now approaching adolescence herself. As she did so, her eyes caught a small wrapped package on the floor that hadn't been there before. For Ivy, if you need me. For Ivy, if you need me, I'm right here. If you need me, I'm right over here. Always. Love, Hannah. Ivy put the CD in the rental car's player. Songs Hannah had picked out just for us filled the car and our chests and our lumpy throats. Hannah would never be gone for good.
Our next reader is Karen Dempsey. She's written on a variety of topics for Brainchild, as well as the New York Times Motherlode, Babel, Full Grown People. She lives in Cambridge with her husband and 2 children, and is very active on Twitter and has her website, karendempsey.com. And today she's going to read from a piece that appeared a couple years back in Brainchild. Thank you.
This piece is called, it's an excerpt from a piece called Erased, Gentrification Comes to the Playground. And I wrote it actually 10 years ago, but it's something that I think about a lot still. The boys on our street had always been a blur to me, one running into the other. They moved in a pack, and I could only guess at who lived in which house. John took closer notice of the brother and sister who lived just a few doors down and spent a lot of time playing hockey together in the street. John said it would be great if the girl could one day babysit Brennan and teach him to play hockey. We didn't even know their names until we read them in the newspaper, after the boy, Ryan, was killed in a stabbing just 2 blocks from our house. He was 16. The article said that Ryan had been walking along the bike path near the playground when he came upon a fight and intervened. He was stabbed to death by a 24-year-old man. In the days after Ryan's death, a memorial grew along the fence and sidewalk in the place where he'd been killed. Candles burned in jelly jars still bearing their labels. Flowers and balloons wilted in the heat. There were Irish flags, a hockey stick and a team jersey, an empty pack of gum, and all along the wooden fence were the handwritten messages from friends, family, neighbors, strangers. Rest in peace, Ryan, trailed over the fence in dozens of different hands. Let Maddie show you the ropes up there. We miss you, someone had written. I never told you how I felt. I never knew you, but I wish I did. Your shamrock was better than Katie's. Biology class was fun with you. You are our angel. Please watch over us. And there was Ryan in photo after photo, little boy face and gleaming black Irish eyes, in a hockey uniform with the rest of his team, in a tux posing with his prom date, huddled on a porch with 4 other boys in a picture with the handwritten caption, "The Crew." And in the perfect cursive of an elderly neighbor named Ruth was the message, "I tried to comfort you that sad evening. My heart is broken." Sitting with Brennan on our front porch, I watched as people, especially young people, moved in and out of Ryan's house those first few days and gathered in the street in quiet groups of 3 or 4. A teenage boy bounced a basketball with Ryan's younger sister. Even with all the activity, the street felt heavy with silence. The morning of the funeral, a procession of teenagers made their way down our street, young people awkward in their dress clothes, the girls stepping carefully in high heels. Since having Brennan, I see my world and everything in it through the lens of new motherhood, a magnified sense of vulnerability that keeps me awake thinking about the dangers we might face every day, toxins, illnesses, unrestrained dogs, careless drivers. I catalog the hazards, nursing my anxiety. When Ryan died, my sister asked whether John and I were struggling with our decision to raise Brennan in the city. But my reaction to Ryan's death was more complicated than fear and more simple. I did experience it through a filter of new motherhood, but what came through, more than my own vulnerability and fear, was a grief and sadness made more raw and vivid than I might have imagined before becoming a parent. Serving as a distant witness to the unimaginable loss of this boy made me feel not less a part of this community, but more connected and committed to it. Sometimes I find myself in front of Ryan's house, strapping Brennan into his car seat as he wrestles against me and laughs at his reflection in the mirror. I cannot help but look up at the front door, where at various times over the past months, someone has found the strength to mark the passing holidays with a dancing leprechaun, with tiny white lights at Christmas, with balloons and a happy birthday sign to mark Ryan's 17th birthday, the birthday he didn't live to see. I think about Ryan's parents, about his mother mostly, and what I might say to her if I meet her, what profoundly insufficient words of sympathy I might speak. Twice from my car, I catch brief glimpses of her as she stoops over a flower pot, as she unlocks her front door. I want to call out to her, but I do not.
Our last reader tonight is Catherine Osmond. She's an award-winning journalist whose articles and essays have appeared in Brainchild, The New York Times, National Geographic, Salon, and elsewhere. And she's at work on her first book, Losing Our Religion. And we welcome her tonight to read from her piece about sibling rivalry.
So I wrote this a couple years ago, and it's been fun going back and reading it. Nothing has changed. My kids are still fighting. But they're just fighting, and they're a little bit older now, so they use bigger words. So I'll read the beginning, and then what was great about doing this story, because it's a feature story, it kind of combines personal memoir with the research. So I got to call all these therapists and say, help me, tell me what's going on here. I won't have time to read all that good middle stuff there, but I'll come back at the end and try to give the conclusion. And it was called All My Children. Our 5.5-year-old daughter, Jessie, is curled in my lap as much as any 5.5-year-old child can curl in her mother's lap. Her long, gangly legs don't quite fit anymore. She's got one thumb in her mouth, the other hand pulled tight to her chest, and her face is resting against my breastbone, the fetal position, kindergarten style. Across the room, Annie, our 18-month-old, sees Jessie in her favorite spot and blows a gasket. Her brow furrows, and she waddles toward us like a mad duck, her brown belly clearing her path as she steps on strewn toys and bangs into the table, then a few chairs en route. She's making a noise I can only describe as keening, and I'm reminded once again of the wild intensity and sheer absurdity of this thing called sibling rivalry. A keening, waddling, pissed-off duck is coming at me as a delicate, too-tall flower lies limp and sad in my arms. This can't end well. Annie reaches us, and with one meaty-armed shove, surprising in force for someone who weighs as much as a holiday turkey, pushes Jessie, who falls from my lap like a long drawn-out tumble, like an origami swan coming unfolded. Wreathing on the floor, Jessie yells, I hate her. Annie smiles, climbs into my lap, tilts her sweet face up to me and chirps, book? William, our 9-year-old son, saunters by on his way to the fridge for a snack, notices Jessie crying, and says offhandedly, she just wants you, like we all do. And with that, our big bookish boy sums up the whole mess. A natural historian peering in through our kitchen window might call the episode a clear case of the survival of the fittest. An economist might deem ours an obvious example of competition for scarce resources, and a writer might wax poetic on the positive outcome of all that sisterly competition, as Simone de Beauvoir once did. Quote, she helped me to assert myself. I believe I should count the fact of having had a sister, younger than myself but close to me in age, as one of my pieces of good luck. Brother-brother, sister-sister, and brother-sister relationships have been mucking up the works ever since Cain fell out with Abel. But as a field of study, sibling relationships are relatively new. While Freud probed parent-child and husband-wife bonds, the study of siblings has long existed in a kind of academic backwater. But with a rise in new ways of looking at these age-old relationships in fields as various as evolutionary psychology, sociology, biology, anthropology, and even zoology, siblings have taken their rightful spot amid the forefront of the study of families. What has emerged can be as thorny as it is fascinating, but at their best, such studies shed new light on these fundamental relationships, which perhaps more than any other shape who we ultimately become. 80% of Americans grow up with at least one brother or sister, and our bonds with our siblings are often the longest lasting and the most intense of our lives. In contrast to parents, whose relationships with us is more authoritarian in nature, our siblings swim alongside us in the family pool, we take baths with them, share bunk beds, kick each other under the dining room table, and wrestle across the back seats of station wagons through the crucial years of our young lives. From such intense, abiding bonds grows a family tree so tangled, so beautiful, and sometimes so bruised that those of us with siblings see traces of them like a fine dust on everything we do, even or perhaps especially when we become parents to siblings ourselves. In my case, I'm particularly attuned to how my kids play and fight with one another because I lost a brother when I was 19, and it wasn't until long after he was gone that I realized how much his life had influenced my own. Will it take a lifetime and a tragedy for my own children to reach similar conclusions? And then I do a lot of research and talk to a lot of really helpful, fascinating people. And toward the end, I come to this conclusion. Armed with all the fruits of this new sibling research, I've started to view our family interactions in a fresh way. I spend 30 minutes rubbing Jesse's back at night, then, exhausted, give William a pat and race off to bed. Differential treatment. As I tend to Jesse's tangled hair before school, Annie climbs onto the Thomas table and dances wildly. Not enough resources. Risk-seeking behavior. When we try to get Jessie to take up basketball, she turns up her nose, saying that's an activity for her big athletic brother. De-identification. I also start trying to put the practices that may well work into use. When, for example, a recent dinner was about to implode, I asked the two big kids to try understanding what the other was feeling. It wasn't pretty. I believe the word nincompoop was tossed around. And I was glad, and here's one of the researchers, Lori Kramer, hadn't wired us all up for close examination, which was how she did her research. And Judy Dunn wasn't lurking in the corner with her notepad in hand. But staying firmly rooted at the dining room table as I attempted to guide them, instead of throwing up my arms in surrender, felt like a small step toward my goal of family peace. The two of them even shared an exaggerated eye roll afterward at my expense, and our little one made us all laugh by making her own version of old lady face. It was a rare instance of family harmony, the sort of thing that we might one day remember, not in stark detail, but in the warm feeling of belonging that washed over us in that moment and remained in some intangible way as night fell around us. Siblings matter. I've always known that, but I guess I hadn't appreciated just how much and in how many ways. But now, as I watch the unfolding tableau of my own children's relationships with one another, I think of how all the moments they spend together and all the feelings that crop up are collecting into the fine dust that they will carry with them, whether they like it or not, for the rest of their lives. Sometimes at night, I watch William and Annie as they play on our bed. He likes to babysit her while I read to Jessie. He carries her up the stairs and bounces her on his lap. Later when I come up, I see her laughing and squealing as he tickles her. He sometimes tells me she is the only person in the family who understands him. I catch my breath. I fight back tears. And I think, what will they give each other in their lifetimes? And how will they break each other's hearts?
Well, that concludes our formal piece of the program. I hope that gives you a good taste of what Brainchild is all about. We certainly believe that motherhood is a very worthy of literature and good writing, and that's what we aim to do with the magazine. I will say that Brainchild really does cover ages 0 to 15, 16, but we do every year do a special issue for parents of teenagers, which is available in the back because it is its own set of issues, different from those that we have when we're parenting younger children. So we invite you to look more at our magazine, and we thank you so much for coming, and I thank the writers. Thank you.